Welcome to Moravian Mornings, the podcast where we explore the lives, history, and culture of the Moravian settlers in Wachovia, North Carolina, and the greater Moravian world. I'm your host, Savannah Franz. Today on Moravian Mornings, we'll be discussing the first enslaved Moravian marriage in Wachovia between Johann and Maria Samuel and their children, focusing in on their daughter Anna Maria Samuel and her education at the girls' school at Salem, the evolution of racial attitudes in Wachovia, and the legacy of women and girls' education in a Moravian context. Joining us to share her expertise is Michelle Hopkins Lawrence. Welcome to the podcast, Michelle Hopkins Lawrence. We'd love to hear about your background and your role at Salem Academy as a teacher and school historian.
So I started teaching at Salem Academy in 2015, and I'm a history teacher there. I work with all grade levels. As far as being the school historian, I got involved in that in 2017 with a history committee at the school when we were looking at our relationship with slavery. And I just found that I loved learning more about the school and started writing about the school and teaching about the school's history, and so was dubbed the school historian at some point.
That's so special. As a Salem alum myself, I'm just so thankful that that is a role that is an option there and that you fulfill that. That's a really special work, so thank you.
Oh, I enjoy it.
Well, to just dive into our subject now, can you tell us a little bit about where does the documented history of the Samuel family's life begin? And what sources have you used to flesh out their life stories?
So we know a lot about the Samuel family because of the Moravian records, which you've probably heard about through historic Bethabara or through Old Salem, that they did a lot of record keeping. All of their meetings, their church meetings, their financial discussions, even how to start the town, what the goal of the town and the entire community of this county would be. And so because of those records, we know a lot about enslaved people, which is pretty rare because, we have their whole family records, we have baptismal records. If there was an enslaved person who was a member of the church, we have names and family histories, and it's something that for a lot of Americans, if you have enslaved ancestors, you don't have access to that information. But this community has that information, and so you just comb through the records and you look for references to them, and we can find out a lot about them. And there is a man named John Sensbach. He's a professor in Florida, and he really did incredible work. His book is called A Separate Canaan, and it's about the African and African American community of North Carolina specifically, and their specific unusual situation of enslaved people in this community, but he did the major work, and so that's an incredible resource as well.
Excellent. It is, from what I've understood as a historian, it is a rarity to have records of enslaved ancestors, and to have any sort of documentation at all is such a wonderful place of study, but also just connection.
Absolutely.
So what inspired you to investigate the story of the Samuels, especially Anna Maria Samuel?
So originally, I came across a reference to Johann Samuel that he had paid the school fees for all of his children. And my first thought, and I think I found this around 2015 or 2016 when I was first teaching at Salem, and my thought was, how is it possible that an enslaved man could actually send his children to school? What kind of a place would allow enslaved children to attend schools? Were these schools segregated? That just piqued my interest. How could this be possible? I didn't know of other communities in the South where that was possible. So I wanted to know more about Johann Samuel. And I think about a year after I got interested in his particular story and wanting to know more about him, there was also a protest at Salem College where the college students wanted to know more about the history of slavery at the school. And so the president at the time, President Sterrett, asked if I would join a history committee and do research with a number of professors and college students and find out more about the history of enslaved people, both going to the school but also being owned or working at the school. And As we did more research, we discovered that not only was Johann Samuel someone who paid fees for his children to go to school, his boys went to school in Bethabara, but there weren't enough girls in Bethabara for his daughter. So his eldest child, who was Anna Maria Samuel, went to Salem and joined the Single Sisters Choir in Salem. And so when she went to school in Salem, she was part of the girls' school that much later became the institution we know as Salem Academy and College today. I mean, all the work that I did as a historian, finding out officially for the school what our involvement in slavery was, is what led to my discovering these really amazing stories about individuals, women and men enslaved and free, and thinking you can't find this story in any other school. And the best way to teach history, I think, especially when you're teaching it to high school students, is to find a story that will hook them.
Yes.
And in the case of Anna Maria Samuel, she is someone who is the same age as our students. And I can remember leading up to the 250th, we did an event where we met on the steps of the Single Sisters house. And I read out from Anna Maria Samuel's memoir what was read when she died. And I read about her. And I said to these students, here in the Single Sisters house, on the floorboards that are still here today, you can walk the floors that she walked on. This is the building where she would have studied, where she would have been part of a religious community, and she was your age. And she also happened to be an enslaved young girl. And that makes a connection to students, and it really helps me as a teacher. And it's a bit of a hook to get them into a discussion about women in education, about different classes of people, about different experiences of slavery. It's a way to make students think beyond just a dry history account, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting storytelling. That's always how I view history.
Yes.
Is like it's just an opportunity for storytelling through tangible primary sources, facts. What is your students' reaction usually when taking this class?
Well, students end up being really drawn in. So at Salem Academy now, we make this a required course. All of our new students will take a course that I titled The Remarkable Women of Salem. And I named it that back in, I think 2018 was the first year I taught it as part of a January term course. And it was a chance to get kids out of the classroom so we could take tours of Salem buildings. Not just the buildings on campus that go back to the 18th century, but also going over to Single Brothers House, going to the boys' school on Salem Square, going to the gun shop, just going into places, especially my favorite one, the Martha Mishk House, and the doctor's house, because Martha Mishk, as a young girl, was a student at Salem's girls' school, and she was the first student to come back as a teacher. And to bring students into those buildings, and it's a real connection. As one of my students said, it's 200 plus years later, and we still have students who come back to be teachers. Because one of my colleagues, two of my colleagues actually, are alums of the school. And for our students to make that connection, again, anything that makes connection with a teenager, it's a good way to get them educated, to get them to ask questions.
I love that. It is a rare gift as a history teacher to truly be able to connect in that way. So at least as someone that was truly inspired to follow in the path of history and teaching that education, it was people like you that really helped me and inspired me to be on this very path. And that is honestly exactly I was so mindful of when I was at Salem, is just walking around and being on these steps and knowing these are almost the exact same steps that, like, even just meeting alums from the 90s, the 60s, knowing that girls and women have been walking around here and learning since well before my time and my great-great-grandparents' time is so humbling.
Yeah, the Moravians were very unusual. They were unusual for multiple reasons, but the two that most impact me, both as a woman and as someone descended from enslaved people, is that They educated girls and women in the 1700s. They built a boys' school. They built a girls' school. I mean, they built churches, the single brothers and single sister house, and the boys and girls schools. Every community, no matter where they were, they did this. And they thought that girls should be educated. It was as important as educating boys to educate their girls. And that was an unusual attitude to have. And it was expressed by a bishop who was born, Comenius, who was born in the 1600s. He thought it was important to educate girls. And it's really rare to find anybody in the 17th century thinking that. The other thing that made the Moravians so unusual was that they were open to educating anybody who wanted to join their community. They thought if you wanted to become a Moravian, if you wanted to become a Christian, you had to be able to read the Bible. It would be a sin not to allow people who are members of the church to read the Bible. And so they did not look at your race or your gender or your legal status as a barrier to education. They were going to educate you so that you could be a member of the church if they approved your becoming a member. And that is just fascinating to me. And it's a story that most Americans don't know about this unusual community in the pre-Civil War South.
Yeah, people, all of us really, that have gone under American education, I think that it can be so, we can just believe that things were only one way and there was only perhaps one experience, especially I think for enslaved people.
That's why I value the work that Hidden Town Project is doing at Old Salem, and here at Bethabara, historic Bethabara Park, there's the Every Voice Heard initiative, and they're doing more work on Peter Oliver and the entire Samuel family since they were living in this community. And another thing that I really love about working at Salem is that in addition to being able to work with all these great historic organizations that are in this city, is the fact that we have our own archives at Salem Academy and College Library. And so I take students to the archives, and the archivist there has been so generous with her time. Donna Rothrock will pull out documents, ledgers going back to the early 1800s, and the students can touch the books, can touch the documents that are their history. And they're always going like, the look on their faces as they're touching these documents, and they're looking at people who were doing, double entry bookkeeping, and they are doing the bookkeeping to the not just a penny, but a quarter of a penny. So there is a third column after the decimal point in the ledgers, and our students who they rely very much on calculators. And you have to say to this 21st century teenager, this was not done with a calculator. They are doing this in their head, and they're doing it line by line. But for them to see how much things cost and what students were buying, and you put those physical records, and then you can take them into the buildings where the people were living who are in the historical record. It makes the history very immediate. They can really understand it as, this is where they lived, here's where they studied. You can take them into the meat cellar. All of these things make it real to them and bring history alive.
Yeah, these were real people.
Yes.
That their lives were just as complicated and mundane. They were just as capable of intelligence and emotional capacity as you. I think that we can forget that just because their lives seemingly were very different than ours, you know?
And 200 to 250 years ago, it seems like forever ago. I mean, a teenager in this century thinks that 1980 was the Dark Ages. So it's hard to make previous centuries come alive. And this is the first time other than when I worked in Boston, and we could go see things like the reenactment of the battles of Lexington and Concord. It is so unusual to be teaching in a place where, George Washington came through here. We can talk about George Washington. You can do American history, and you can do it from Salem Square, and you can touch upon so many different topics, from the Industrial Revolution because of the textile mills, to women's education, to civil rights. You can connect all those things because it happened right there. And so it's just a great opportunity. It's one of the things I love teaching at Salem.
We really are in a special little place here.
Yes.
I love it. I feel so lucky all the time. Can you tell me a little bit more about the importance of education in Moravian communities and how their educational systems impacted the lives of the Samuel family?
So education was really important to Moravians. We know this going back to the 1600s. Bishop Amos Comenius famously said that women were just as much the children of God as men were. He said famously that women were made in the image of God, and there were people pre-modern times within European Christian community who argued that women were somehow misbegotten children of God, not like Adam, equal to his stature. And so this was a remarkable thing in the 1600s. And Salem Academy and College is very proud of the fact that we were established as a school for girls where it was thought to be important for girls to have an education just like boys. And you see it not only in Salem, but you can go up to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. You can go to European Moravian communities, and you'll see always a boys' school and a girls' school. And even somebody like Rebecca Proughton, who was an enslaved woman of the Caribbean who ends up becoming free by the Moravian Church, and she established a school in West Africa. So, Moravian schools are all over. You can find them in South America and Nepal today. And so this emphasis on education is very important in the Moravian community. And it goes back to you need to be able to read so that you can read the Bible. That's the most basic reason why education is important. Although Comenius also talked about the fact that women's minds need to be occupied, because when your mind isn't occupied, you'll be meddling. And that was one of his arguments. If you're afraid of women meddling, you should keep their minds occupied, because then they will have less time for meddling.
Yeah, less time for meddling.
Yes,
There's a book.
that's the name of the book for that Frances Griffin wrote for the history of the school in the 1970s. And she took that quote, "less time for meddling," from Comenius. And so you had this incredible emphasis on education of boys and girls. And yes, it was education in reading and writing and basic skills like even needlepoint. But it is also, in the early years of the school, you find in the 1700s and early 1800s, they're doing history and geography. And eventually by the Civil War, they're doing science. They were doing math even before the Civil War. So they really were having what we would call a high school education. Of course, there were certain topics like DNA that they didn't know existed yet, but they were having a real, true education, the way we would recognize a high school education. And this was a terrific thing for the community. And what then so when you look at Moravians, you're like, oh, they're so weird. They're educating girls in the 1700s. And on top of that, they're educating enslaved boys and girls. They just stick out like a sore thumb from this entire community, from their surroundings in the American South. But they would have stuck out also in New York and in Pennsylvania because, and let's not forget, they were also educating the Cherokee Moravians. We know that there were 13 Cherokee students in the 1800s. Even in the 1870s, students came from Oklahoma, what was called Indian territory at the time. And so if you think about, I've said to my students, it's unusual to think about because we think, history only goes in one direction. But there were non-white people at Salem Academy and College in the 19th century, but then not at the beginning of the 20th. It takes until after 1960 for that to happen again. As somebody at Salem says, we started out really good when it came to integration and being progressive and open to all. Then we have a long period of not doing well, and then we get better. So that today, the school is one of the most diverse schools in the country, something to celebrate our diversity. But we do have that long period when it basically became an all-white institution.
That's something that I noticed when I went to Salem. Is I was like, even such a small student body, I'd walk around and just be like, in every way under the sun, I was just like, wow, this is a very diverse school in thought in race, in sexuality, in gender expression.
And in class as well, in social class or socioeconomic status. It is, and not just the student body, but also the faculty and staff. It's something that I greatly value teaching at Salem, and I've been in education for 30 years. It is the most diverse place that I have worked as both an employee and student body, and it's something I highly value about Salem.
Can you give me an overview of the Samuels family? I know that's a big order.
So the Samuel family story actually starts in the 1760s with Sam. His name is Sam. He was actually the first person purchased by the church here in what we call Forsyth County today. And he says that he wants to join the church. And the church approves his joining, and he is actually baptized in 1771. And what's remarkable about his baptism, it happens on November 13th in the brand new Gemein House, which was being consecrated in Salem, which I don't know if you know the Moravian church very well in this area. Salem, what we call the Salem Home Church, which is the Church of Salem. So its founding date is November 13th, 1771, and Johann Samuel was the very first person ever baptized in the original congregation. And he was known as, he's a slave named Sam, essentially, in the records. But when he becomes a Christian, he gets a new name. And this happened for the enslaved members of the church. When they would become Christians, they would take a new name. So Oliver becomes Peter Oliver. And he's well known in the community today. And Sam becomes Johann Samuel. So Samuel becomes the family name. And within a few years, he marries a woman who is also enslaved, but becomes a baptized member of the community, and her name is Maria. And Johann and Maria, their marriage has been described by John Sensbach as the first African Moravian marriage of the South. And they're members of the community, so when their first child, their oldest daughter, is born in 1781 on Christmas Eve, she was baptized that night. And she was brought up in the language of the church, which was German, and taught English, and grew up as a Moravian from her birth, whereas Johann and her mother Maria were converts.
So why might have Samuel have asked for the Moravian church to purchase him rather than continuing to rent his enslaved labor?
So there's a lot of, if you think about this, there can be a lot of protection offered by the Moravians. So if you think about enslaved people in the 1700s who are under threat of being sold away, being separated from loved ones, of not having, they don't own property, they legally don't control themselves. But becoming a member of the church could give them some measure of control. It would give them privileges within the church that weren't legally recognized by the state of North Carolina. And actually, Johann Samuel had become a member of the church before there was a state of North Carolina. He's still living in the British Empire when he converts in 1771. But the point is that when you go from the slave system of the British Empire into early American history, there are no legal protections for men like Johann Samuel or Peter Oliver. And so by becoming members of the church, they get a certain measure of protection. The church would keep them together with their families. They would have some rights as a family recognized by the church, if not by the legal authorities of the state. And as long as they worked within the system, which meant following the rules, as long as they were willing to do that, they were protected by the community. And I especially think of it in terms of women. If you think about women in slavery, one of the greatest evils that I think of slavery is that women couldn't choose who their partners were, couldn't choose who their children were, couldn't even guarantee that their children would stay with them after being weaned. And so the idea that if you're a woman who's owned by the Moravian community, if you petition for them to buy you, you will have a measure of agency, of protection against rape, of being kept with your children, some measure of assurance that you might be able to stay with your family and have a choice in who your husband, the father of your children, would be. And I think that's a remarkable thing that would have probably drawn multiple men and women to ask to be members of the church, which isn't to say that none of them had religious motivation, that they weren't true converts. But I can't imagine that the benefits of joining the church weren't also a part of their decision to convert to Moravian Christianity.
How does the purchase of Johann Samuel and then Maria and their conversion to Moravianism impact the Southern Moravian congregations, their relationship to race, both spiritually and socially?
So originally, the Moravians were not going to own anyone. They had no problem with renting enslaved people. And so we know that, for example, Peter Oliver, he was originally rented from his owner. Johann Samuel was also originally rented. And Samuel and Oliver would have both been in their teens or late teens when they were being rented before they asked to be purchased. And apparently being purchased, well, the Moravians thought we have to own them if we're going to allow them to become members of the church, because it's the only way to make sure they can be members of the church, that they can follow our rules, go to church on Sunday, be a part of the religious community. But there was a great deal of controversy. There were many Moravians saying we shouldn't own people. And it's not necessarily that they were abolitionists. Moravians clearly, we have from their records where they say they were not going to work against slavery because slavery was the law of the land. When they moved to the British colonies, they were aware that they were part of the British Empire and they had to obey the rules of the British Empire. So they weren't abolitionists. At the same time, they were self-sufficient communities. And they were very economically planned communities so that each town would have one baker and one potter and there would not be competition. And so they didn't want to bring in too much enslaved labor because they thought that would disrupt their planned economy. And so there's this constant tension of, should we be more like the people of North Carolina about the people around us and have enslaved people? Should we follow the model of the people around us? So they make all these restrictions about slavery, and almost all of those restrictions are gone by the 1840s. But at least in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there's a lot of disagreement about how much should we participate in the slave economy of North Carolina and how much should we stand apart from it. In the end, the economics of being like the rest of North Carolina win out. Absolutely, they win out. But in the beginning, what's interesting is that somebody like Johann Samuel was given a great deal of freedom. So he was owned by the community, but we know from the records that he was given leeway. He would be sent on errands where you might be gone for days, buying provisions somewhere or selling provisions. There are records of his trips to other parts of North Carolina. And he always comes back. He's trusted to come back. He's trusted with money. He's trusted with the wagon and the horses. At one point, he's even in charge of the farm here in Bethabara. He is running the farm, and he is giving instructions to people for the management of Bethabara's economy. And we also know that later in his life, you'll see the changing attitudes, because there's a well-known story of, and John Sensbach talks about this in A Separate Canaan, that one of the Moravians who had been here for years and told his son, who had been born here. So this is a Moravian who came from Pennsylvania, and before Pennsylvania, probably Germany. And he's telling his son to do what, basically to take instruction from Johann Samuel. And the son and the father come nearly to blows in the Moravian account, because the son feels that that would be demeaning for him to take orders from an enslaved person, from an African American. Like, that person is not to tell me what to do. And so you can see the change in attitude, that whereas an older member of the community, first generation Salemite or person of Bethabara, has no problem giving deference to Johann Samuel's knowledge and experience. And the next generation is like, no, you can't put me under the supervision of a black man. That's just not right.
I really think that like Salem and Bethabara is such an interesting little case study of the tension of a religious separatist community mixed with a economic community in the Southern economy, and balancing that out as it changes from a colony of the British Empire, a country in itself.
Yes.
And how the changing attitudes at the time, and even just like a story of like assimilation into the general Southern economy and Southern standard of thinking at the time. So that's just really fascinating.
There's another example of how attitudes are changing as well. So that we know in the Moravian Church, and this shocked me the first time I read it. So Johann Samuel is baptized in November of 1771. That is an integrated church service. Women sit on one side of the church, men sit on the other, but it's black and white women, some free, some enslaved, sitting together. Same thing with men. And they exchange a ritual kiss of peace at Moravian services. Now it's a handshake, but then it was a kiss. And so these are black and white members of the community giving a kiss of peace. These are black and white members of the community living together in single sisters, having meals together, the same thing in the single brother's house. But we know that at some point at the turn of the century, from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, first there was a segregation in that, yes, black and white people worship in the same church building, but they're now sitting separately. At some point, it's referenced that the black brethren were held back until all the white brethren sat down first, so that the black members of the church would sit in the back. And then by the time you get to 1820s, they're in a separate building entirely. And so you can see how a community that was integrated in the 1700s becomes a segregated community in the 1800s. And then it will take another 100+ years to become integrated again. And it's really strange to think that this community was more integrated in the 1700s than it was in the early 1900s. But that was how this community existed and evolved.
That the Moravians profess, how would that be evident in the lives that they lead in the Moravian Church? And what would this spiritual equality even look like?
Well, I think the biggest evidence of spiritual equality is in the integrated church services in the 1700s, and then the way the children are raised. The fact that Anna Maria Samuel, when she's a young girl, as I said, there weren't enough, apparently there weren't enough girls in Bethabara to make a class of girls and the choir of younger girls among the single sisters. So the Samuel boys stayed here in Bethabara, and the one daughter, Anne Maria, she goes to Salem. And she's accepted into the single sisters' house in 1793 as part of the younger girls' choir. And she's there from 1793 to 1795. And we know from the diary of the single sisters' house that she and two other girls from Bethabara came at the same time, and that they participated in a love feast, a church service, that they went to classes. The diary says that they were part of the life of the single sisters. That meant in education, in prayer, in mealtime together, and in chores. And she doesn't seem, there's nothing in the record that indicates that she's being treated differently than the other members of Single Sisters. And this is in the 1790s. Remember, she's born in 1781. She is baptized on the day she's born, and she apparently grows up as a Moravian daughter. The difference is legally she's enslaved. Now, the entire family is eventually freed at the end of the 1700s. The community of Bethabara goes to the trouble. They want to free Johann Samuel. They want to free the whole family. Apparently, Johann Samuel's wife was supposed to be free anyway because she was actually not enslaved for life on the original terms of her purchase. She had a white mother and a black father. And the rules governing her legal situation was that she was supposed to be free at the age of 31. And so the town of Bethabara, or the entire church community, they go through the trouble of going all the way to the capital of North Carolina to get them freed. So eventually the whole family becomes free. But during these times, the boys and the sons and the daughter, there ends up being two daughters, they are apparently educated and accepted as members. But again, that all changes by the early 1800s. I don't think at all that Anne Maria, had she been born a decade later, would have been allowed to go to Single Sisters. I don't think once the boarding school is established for girls in Salem, that the planter families who were coming from Tennessee or South Carolina would have accepted their daughters being in a boarding school with enslaved children or free black members of the community either, because we have to remember there are both enslaved and free African Americans living in this county at the time. And so to go back to your original question, Anne Maria at least seems to be a full member of the Moravian community, participating in prayer services. We know that her father, for example, he sponsored baptisms. We know from the records through the 1800s that black members of the church would sponsor each other, and that their names would be recorded, but also their owners' names, which is one of the things that when you're looking at the records, this is how there are different rules, because you've got a baptismal record that lists sponsors and parents, but also lists the owners of the sponsors and the parents, or lists the person who might be a free black man who is the sponsor. But at least with the Samuel family, we know that Johann Samuel sponsored baptisms. He was in other words, he was a godfather to people. And theoretically, if Anne Maria had lived past the age of 17, she would have also done something similar.
Black Moravians existed in a carefully balanced world between general spiritual equality and the dehumanization of enslavement by their own church. What are some of the ways the Samuels would have had to navigate this world in their own specific way?
Well, one thing that all of the enslaved members of this community had to do was follow the rules. This is true of all members of the community, whether they were white or black, free or enslaved. You had to follow the rules, and you could be excommunicated. You could be tossed out. There are examples, the occasional couple who marry without permission and they get kicked out. But there is this special, or if not special, there's a situation or the reality. There is the reality that for enslaved Moravians, being kicked out could mean being sold away. And so that was a legal threat over them that did not exist for free members of the community. And I would think that even someone like a Peter Oliver, once he became free, if you lost your place in this community, it would be harder as a free black person to exist somewhere else. So, and there's the threat of perhaps being re-enslaved, being kidnapped into slavery. And so you see that enslaved members of the community, and even those who had been enslaved but were freed, like the Samuels and Oliver, or because the Samuels' later children are born free. Once their parents are free, when there's more children born, they're born free. But they would have all been whether free or enslaved Black people in North Carolina, in the American South at the turn of the beginning of the 1800s, and all of the legal threats that were there for Black people trying to make their way in North Carolina would have been part of their lives, which was not there for free white members of the community.
What can you tell me about Anna Maria Samuel's life and education? What does that tell us about race in the Southern Moravian world at the time?
The fact that she's educated just like all of the other students or young girls of the community shows the spiritual equality among the Moravians at the time.
Yeah.
And we usually use the phrase spiritual equality because it's very clear that enslaved and free African American Moravians were considered equals in the church in the 1700s. But of course, there is no equality. There is no legal rights that enslaved people have. And that even by the time you get to the 1800s, it's believed important for them to have a church. It's going to be a separate church now. They can still marry within the church. And of course, these are not legal marriages as far as the state is concerned. There will still be a minister who will officiate at their funerals, but the funerals are now in a segregated cemetery. So Peter Oliver and Anne Maria Samuel, they are part of God's Acre. Anne Maria, you can find her grave today in the Single Sister section of Bethabara, God's Acre. Peter Oliver is buried in the main God's Acre in Salem. But by the time you get after their deaths, you start to have segregated burials. So there is a separate graveyard for Black people buried after, I think it's the 1820s. After 1821 is when the graveyards are segregated. So you can see that there was much more spiritual equality even in death in the 1700s and very early 1800s, and then even in death you get segregation later. And that is another thing. As someone I have studied slavery in different continents and different eras and different legal systems. And there were two things that shocked me when I first came to Winston-Salem. One was discovering that there were enslaved people buried in God's Acre, because my experience was, well, this is a Southern graveyard dating back to the 1700s. It should be segregated. And one was finding out that the schools were integrated in the 1700s, because I couldn't think of any other place where you would find that. And I did not know about the Moravians before coming to this area of the country in the early 2000s, and discovering, even before I took the job at Salem Academy and College, discovering that how unusual these Moravians were. I'm like, okay, I want to know more about these people who were doing these very strange things. I mean, the rest of their surrounding neighbors must have thought the Moravians were off their rockers to be doing this social and economic experiment, having children as young as 10 go live in a single sister's and a single brother's house, having a planned economy, trusting the lot to choose your spouse, giving women the right to say no when they were asked if they wanted to marry. The people here just must have seemed so strange to the surrounding communities of North Carolina. But they made it work. And I'm glad that they did, because there wouldn't be a Salem Academy and College if they hadn't made it work. And who knows what this community would have been if Salem hadn't been founded here. I mean, Salem is here before Winston is here. And it's such an unusual community. And as a historian, I like the quirky people from the past. They're the ones that I like to read about and learn more about.
I couldn't agree more. When coming to work here, I didn't even know how quirky they were. And the more that I learned, I'm just like, I'm obsessed with these like religious separatist, communalist, utopian like community. And the more I learn about their theology, I'm like, wow, what unique people. And it's such it's affirming and fun to learn more about them in all of their facets.
Yes. And I think it's also interesting because we tend to think sometimes I think that we think nobody could be modern the way we're modern. And so to look back and go, well, there was this community that 250 years ago was treating enslaved people like spiritual equals and letting them go to school, and they were living together and eating together and being buried side by side, and race didn't matter in the burial system. So in other words, you might think that only people today can be that advanced in their thinking. And then to say, well, there were people here more than 200 years ago who were thinking more like you. And then in the 1800s, unfortunately, they started thinking more like traditional slavery and racism and segregation and everything connected to that, to then get back to the point where we are now. Sometimes it's not linear progression, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Certainly not. If history has proven anything over and over again, it's a little cyclical.
Yes.
That's why we need to learn history. So to wrap up, where can we read or listen to some of your work, and are there any projects you're currently working on?
Well, first, for things to read, I love to point people to the Salem Academy and College website, or you can just look up Anna Maria Samuel Project. If you go to Anna Maria Samuel Project for Salem Academy and College, it has some things that I've written, things that other members of our school community, like Jesse Bowman, who I referenced earlier, the research that we did, Dr. Grant McAllister from Wake Forest University, his research is posted there, and also a history about the committee, the History Committee for Salem, as well as links to Hidden Town Project of Old Salem Museums and Gardens, and a wonderful story map that Jesse Bowman created. So if you want to see pictures as well as maps and paintings of Old Salem, and as much as we've been able to discover about the school and its enslaved students as well as its enslaved workers, it's all published there. As far as what I'm working on now, I have been working with Every Voice Heard initiative at Historic Bethabara Park. They're in the process, Bethabara Park is in the process of expanding its information on enslaved people like Peter Oliver and the Samuel family, and wanting to talk more about the children connected to the Samuel family, so you don't just get a view of the adults in the community, but also enslaved younger people in the community. And that's really the major thing that I've been doing right now.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed this.
Well, Michelle Hopkins Lawrence, it has been truly such a privilege to be able to talk to you, both as a Moravian historian and just as a fellow member of the Salem Academy and College community. So thank you for sharing all of your wealth of knowledge with us.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Historic Bethabara Park is both a National Historic District and a public city park. Park grounds are open year-round from dawn to dusk. Guided tours are available during visitor center open hours. Moravian Mornings is a production of Historic Bethabara Park. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, shoot the Moravian Mornings team an email at historicbethabarapark@gmail.com. For open hours, information about our events, programs, exhibits, and resources about the Moravians in North Carolina, visit our website at historicbethabarapark.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Come visit the birthplace of Winston-Salem in person at 2147 Bethabara Road, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 27106.